Hey everyone, welcome to Chapter 12. And Chapter 12 is the next step in the evolution of our democracy as we founded our country and created these three branches of government. And this is the presidency. And in this chapter, we're going to look at the role of the president and the office of the presidency, because there's a difference between the president and the presidency. The president is the individual who leads our country, kind of like the global ambassador, if you would, to the country. The presidency encompasses the office of the president, which includes the vice president, the first lady, the whole infrastructure inside the White House that allows for this country to operate. It includes this president's cabinet, all those various secretaries like Secretary of Labor, all those different folks all reside in there. It also includes the federal bureaucracy that is underneath the umbrella of the executive branch or the office of the presidency, as it is called sometimes. So it's a vast infrastructure beyond just the individual who we know to be the president. Now, okay, let me jump into this. So, when you think about the world at large, the President of the United States is probably, if not number one, in the top three of the most important people on the planet. Because of the nature of our country, I would say our president, along with Russia and China, are probably the three most preeminent leaders in the world today. So the role that that individual serves is a tremendously important role. It's a stressful role. Most people come in looking spry and young and youthful when they leave, whether by after their terms of office or don't get voted out. They look pretty beat up, most of them. I remember Obama came in, his hair was all nice and dark. By the time he left office, his hair was white. So, yeah, it beats you up pretty good. Um, but in terms of the responsibility of the president's job is charged with protecting the Constitution. And let me digress from it and say, even in the previous chapter, which I failed to mention in Congress, in fact, all these branches of government, including the Supreme Court, they swear an oath to the Constitution, not to a political party, not to any other group, but to the Constitution. So when you see politics being played out at a lower level, meaning they're looking at either Democrats or Republicans are playing games with each other, they we forget sometimes that it's not about that individual and that group and their particular interest. They swear an oath to that Constitution first and foremost. And if anything that either side does to supersede that, that's a violation of the law. And we have to do a better job as we, the people, of making sure that we know the rights and responsibilities of based on the Constitution, to hold our representatives accountable for what they do or do not do uh, with regard to the Constitution. Um, we've seen over the last 200 plus years that there has been a growth in the presidential power over that period of time. Early on in the inception of the president, it was very much um, the president was more of like just a watchdog, very administrative based, because one, setting up the structure of the country was first and foremost. But secondly, I would say, and probably equally, if not more important, that the founding fathers realized that the people were not had no taste for having a leader who was a monarch or potentially had the ability to become a monarch in the system. That's why we created this democracy, to give people a chance to have a say in what's going on in government. Uh, and it was during the Constitutional Convention that the presidency or the supreme leader idea became, or sovereign leader came to fruition. That set up the structure that we live with today with regard to the president and the power of the president, as well as the roles and responsibilities and power of the president as well. Those things are all equally as important. So there have been many debates about whether or how presidential power is used or abused, uh, and whether they should put limits on the power of the presidency. Some presidents have taken advantage of it and have almost turned us into an autocracy. Uh, Now, people say Donald Trump is trying to do that, and I'm not going to go there in this particular, because it's not my job to sell you one or the other. But certainly, by not by denying the election, that certainly does uh, put us in a very dangerous position, no matter who's in office, with regard to suggesting those kinds of things. Um, but there were some other ones in the 19th century and even early 20th century who also tried to enhance their presidential power as well. So it's not a foregone conclusion and not unusual for people to try to fortify their power. And arguably, you could say there was a justification for having the leader have a little bit more power so they could get things done. Um, okay, so the nomination process for the president and the roles and responsibilities of that individual goes. There's a process by which how the elections are, how presidential elections happen. And there's a series of primaries from every state that basically lead up into the presidential race that happens in November. The election in November. It's always in November, um, and this is when they kind of get a feel for how well they're doing in getting a chance to win the nomination. Historically, what used to happen was you would have where there'd be several people running for office in both political parties, and both political parties have their own primaries for every single state. So you would have, let's say, 10 people for the Republicans and 10 for the Democrats that start off at the beginning, usually year to a year and a half out, saying, "Hey, yep, I'm going to run for president." And then as the primaries happen and they either at the city they start to lose, right? People aren't getting enough people to be interested in them, then the numbers start to drop. So now say by a year out, it might be down to 6 people. And then let's say there's 6 people left in that particular political party who are still running. And as the primaries continue, depending on how they do, will determine whether they stay in the race or get out of the race. And usually it's also a money game by then as well. So if they're not gaining money, then they usually will step out of the race. And that's very common in terms of the practice. Um, Again, as the when the individuals been elected, then the next step is to get themselves or get their infrastructure, meaning the office of the presidency, organized. So within a very short period, they have to figure out who's going to be in their cabinet, who's going to serve in all these various roles, and they have to appoint a lot of different people. Usually, those who have been either involved in their political campaigns or have done some favors for them, or the people they usually take care of or hook up in these positions. The bad part about that potentially is that they can also can place people in these positions with no experience. And that's one of the things, one of my biggest criticisms of allowing the president to select people to positions that have no experience in those areas. That's a very dangerous precedent, which is what happened with, like, for example, with FEMA when they had the floods in New Orleans. This is going back 20 years ago, and all these people died. It's a result of the fact that the FEMA director had no experience in emergency management. It was just an old golf buddy friend of George Bush Sr.'s wife, for example, who had been a golf buddy that was who had been appointed early on in this time. And then the next FEMA directors after that have all been people who had basically, other than one, had very limited experience in emergency management. So those are the kind of things you have to be careful of when you look at who you're putting into or appointing to these different positions. Um, so again, when we talk about the public presidency, of course, there's also how communication is established with the public, general public. The president has his State of the Union address, where every year he gives his like rally and explains his plan of action to the people. That usually happens in late January, and he gets a chance to sort of build or fortify his base, talk about the things he's done that have worked really well, try to minimize the things that he hasn't done well or that are still in process. And also at this point, this is also where if he's got a really powerful first lady or somebody who's really on top of their game, where he can use the first lady to help bridge some of the gaps and warm up to the people in a way that sometimes the president necessarily can't. Yes, the president can execute executive orders. This is one of those complicated situations where Congress can shoot down certain things and veto the president. If the president doesn't sign, like, Congress can override a presidential veto with a two-thirds vote in both houses of Congress. So even if the president did say, no, I'm not going to sign this bill into law, Congress still has the final say if they so choose to go over the president's head. Now, The president can also bypass the Congress by using what's called executive agreements. And these are not permanent agreements necessarily. These are temporary agreements, but they become similar to laws that allow the president to execute his plan of action to get things done without congressional approval. Usually there's pushback with this, so Congress will chime in, but the president does have the ability to use executive agreements to get things done. He also has the ability to pardon individuals who are convicted felons and things like that. I think this is a major no-no. I think this is something the president should not be involved in. I think this is a little bit overreach for presidential power, because if the president has any potential people have done, who have supported him, who have done not good things, then this gives the president the ability to pardon that person, even if they are a criminal, and including himself, if the president's a criminal. So there should never be anyone above the law, in my opinion. As I mentioned already, the power of the veto. He is the commander in chief of the armed forces, and he's also has the diplomatic power to negotiate treaties, even though the treaties have to be approved by Congress. The president is the first person to be able to go and deal with those things. Again, the judicial review process, this is the checks on presidential power. If the judicial system is doing, and the Congress are doing their job is to make sure the president's not doing anything stupid. And when Congress isn't doing its job, or if the judicial system is failing itself, then we have a real problem in stabilizing our democracy if we allow for one entity to override the other one, or not protect the people from any particular president who might be trying to usurp power, for example. And then, of course, the vice president, if the president, something happens to the president, our vice president is the next person in line. Typically, I would say that most vice presidents don't have that much influence, even though you could argue in the more recent times it has become more significant. I would say Dick Cheney is probably the most prolific vice president we've had, along with Joe Biden, were two that were very influential and significant. But overall, the vice president can start doing the job that the president don't want to do. So the president doesn't want to go to Siberia, he sends the VP off to do that kind of stuff. It's not that often that you see many vice presidents become the president. More recently, in the last 40 years, more so than previously, but it's still, just because you're the VP doesn't always give you a pathway to the presidency. We've seen it not fail multiple times in history. So one of the things that we talk about when we look at, presidential actions and decisions, we can go back and look at empirical evidence and look at, which presidents were significant in history, which ones weren't. I would argue that that's still a very subjective issue, because one of the things I will say is that the presidents, you could potentially have a really great president, but nothing much is going on, domestically or globally. So it could be a quiet time in history. So they're not looked upon with great reverence. And sometimes you can have a very average president, but there's a lot of crises going on, and how they respond at that time may give them more gravitas, or more of an image than some of the people who were considered lesser. So like Lyndon Johnson is one of my favorite presidents, and Harry Truman's one of my favorite presidents, and yet both of them are sort of pushed aside over by FDR, certainly for Harry Truman, and then Dwight Eisenhower comes right after him, and then on the other side of that you've got with Johnson, you had Kennedy before Johnson, and you got Nixon after Johnson. So sometimes people are swallowed up by these things. But if you watch the video clip for this chapter on the Great Society, you'll see a lot of what you as students have benefited from is directly derived from what President Johnson did and what he accomplished. And also for Harry Truman, who was the only president to desegregate the armed forces, so that black troops and Hispanic troops could serve with white troops. And he had the courage to do that, even though it cost him another presidency, another run at the presidency. So some of the challenges of being president, of course, having limited powers, or having your executive powers that are limited by virtue of the Constitution. We've seen some struggle with this more recently. Certainly, former President Trump has tried to change this and navigate it in ways that serve his interest. And that I can't speak to that other than the fact of saying, the presidents are constantly trying to either publicly or privately trying to enhance their power. When they realize that they can't always get things done by using Congress, or if Congress is basically purposely impeding them from accomplishing the task they want to accomplish. Um, so, of course, again, the impact of technology and in public opinion and in public perception is always really important, particularly in the modern times. Unfortunately, the presidential race has become a big money game. They estimate about 15 to 16 billion dollars, billion with a B, is going to be spent on the presidential race this year. That's just tells you we've got something really wrong in our system, that the individual can't be somewhere, be able to speak their mind, share with the public what their vision is, and be able to do that without spending $16 billion of our money. That is crazy. But that's where we live today with all the media influence in the presidential race. Of course, in the global perspective, the president's role and responsibilities are tremendous. He is basically the known leader of the world, of the free world, and so it's really important, I would say, for this person to make sure, or for us, the people, to make sure that the person who represents us in this space um, has both international and domestic, meaning local experience as well. I think that's really tough to ask for any individual to be great at both of them, but having an individual who's leader of the free world who knows nothing about the free world is a pretty dangerous place to be as well. So I would argue that it's the more experience that we have in a president, the better off we are. Even though it's ironic to think that to be the president, all you have to do is by virtue of where you're born and your age. That's pretty crazy. That's where we have found ourselves. And that's it for this chapter. So I will see you next chapter, in chapter 13, which deals with the judicial branch, the courts. Have a great day.